Welcome to the Japanese History Podcast. Today we'll be diving into the Heian Period. Why is it called the Heian Period? Because the capital and court of Japan was moved to a new city, called just Heian. Heian was, like Nara, modeled after the Chinese capital of the time, built in a grid-like pattern. Heian would, after the Heian period ended, continue to serve as the official capital of the land, all the way until 1868. But that's still in the future for now. Heian might not ring a bell for some, but the city is known under different names. It is also called Miyako, meaning capital. This is how the first Europeans came to know it. Later it started to be called something new and gained its current name, Kyoto. The Heian period could perhaps be described as when Japan really becomes Japan. For starters, the language of the court is changing. One example is that from the year 889, Japanese history stops being recorded in Chinese and becomes a fully Japanese language subject. While the court and officials still speak, read and write Chinese, two newcomers to the alphabet scene has come on. Enter hiragana and katakana. Developed by women who were not allowed to learn to read Chinese, these two handy scripts were soon adopted by the whole literate class. A key difference is that the Chinese characters, who are logographic, could be quite complicated to use. They work quite well for Chinese. One character equals one word. Chinese doesn't conjugate, so it only needs the word in its root form. Japanese, however, is riddled with conjugation, and so had to use the Chinese character just for their sounds. Well, now they could use hiragana, a phonetic script instead, except they didn't. They mixed them together into what is now the notoriously complex Japanese writing system. Something to note around this time is that the Japanese scholars are making a difference between kanbun, Chinese writing, and wabun, Japanese writing. Kanbun was usually used for things such as official documents and scholarly work, while wabun was used for more leisurely brain fodder, like novels and poetry, both of which flourished in the Heian period. Something we'll have to take a look at in another episode. As we know from the previous episode, the court moved away from Nara to get away from the meddling Buddhist monks who were growing too powerful. And this actually worked. While Nara remained a Buddhist stronghold, the clergy's influence over the court was much reduced. The Buddhist temples became local power centers, and during this time, new sects arose. The court had a special interest in encouraging these new sects of growing, since they would replace the old ones, who had tried to wrestle power from the imperial seat. To facilitate their growth, the court would imply that the old sects were corrupt, while the new ones were more Japanese. Another way we can see that the Japanese are trying to form their own identity away from China. Up until this point, Japan had been trying to copy China in almost everything. The two largest sects that arose were the Shingon and Tendai. Let's have a closer look at them. Shingon is, ironically, a Chinese Buddhist sect who was brought over by a monk who had earlier been a Confucian scholar official in the Japanese court. During a trip to China, he had converted to the Shingon sect and introduced it into the nobility. Their main temple was built on the mountain south of Heian. Shingon became popular with the court and nobles, as it was an aesthetic form of Buddhism. The rich have always had an eye for the art, and the school of Shingon claims that the messages that are too complex to be understood from scripture can be understood in the form of art. The other sect was Tendai, and this was a biggie. This sect, also of course from China, seek to establish itself as independent from other sects and influences, much like the original sect in China had done. They believe that Buddhist scholarly work must be done by reading source material only, and that it is possible for anyone to reach enlightenment in this life. This school would be the main influence of Japanese Buddhism, and would be the tree from which branches like Zen would spring. Buddhism, however, was still a religion for the upper class. The rough and tough ordinary Japanese fellow still stuck to the old ways, the Shinto tradition. The Shinto shrines and their staff soon realized that it can't keep going on like they've been. Buddhism is stealing all the sunshine, so they started to formalize and make Shinto more coherent, and with that they had some solid ground to stand on when facing off the Buddhists. It usually didn't come to clash, however. The Buddhists mainly seek to coordinate with local shrines, and keep on the locals' best side. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines didn't mind teaming up, especially when it came to fighting their common enemy, demons and evil spirits. It wasn't uncommon during this time for a Miku, a Shinto priestess, to scout out the location for a potential evil spirit. Then, when they knew what they were dealing with, they could bring in some heavy weapons, a fully kitted Buddhist monk who could exorcise the demon. Let's shift our focus back to the court. What's going on there? Imperial power had remained strong until the 800s, when our old pals the Fujiwara clan came up with a new plan. This would be the beginning of Japan's long tradition of puppet governments. A puppet government is when the ruler, in this case the emperor, doesn't actually have any real power. But because of the illusion of power that comes with the position, people still obey. However, the real power lies with someone else, who has control over the person nominally in charge. So it was with the Fujiwara. The clan chief would marry his oldest daughter to the emperor, and as soon as they had their son and heir, the head of the Fujiwara would convince the emperor to abdicate, leaving the infant son in charge of Japan. Now, a small infant child is not likely to do a good job of ruling a country, so of course he needed some help. Enter the titles of Sessho and Kanpaku. Sessho is the title of the regent of a child emperor, and Kanpaku is the title of a powerful advisor of an adult emperor. As we know, these titles were held by the Fujiwara. The head of the clan would become the Sessho to his grandchild, and when he grew up, the Fujiwara leader would become the Kanpaku. And as soon as the emperor took an interest in ruling the country he was the emperor over, he would be convinced to abdicate to leave room for another infant, and the Fujiwara leader would again become Sessho. This went on for about 200 years, when finally, as we passed the year 1000, things are starting to get bad for the Fujiwaras. A long streak of female births leads to the instability in the line of the succession, and in 1068, an emperor that isn't as closely related to the Fujiwara clan ascends to the throne. The Fujiwaras were, of course, displeased with this turn of events, and tried to get rid of the new emperor, ruling in his own right. But the emperor stayed one step ahead. He abdicated and became a Buddhist monk. As we know, Buddhist temples were still influential, and big ones were right next to Heian. This emperor died just 1 year after ruling behind the scenes as an abdicated emperor. But his successor saw the potential of ruling away from home, at a comfortable distance away from the Fujiwara. He repeated the process and wielded his power away from the court. Now there was an emperor in Heian, but the real power lay with the abdicated emperor. Something else is going on simultaneously around this time, away from the emperor. We'll have to rewind a bit first, however. As we know, according to the land reforms, people who tamed new land and started to farm it could keep that land in their own possession. This worked well, and a lot of new land had been laid bare for agriculture. Some of this land was of course supervised by the clergy, both Shinto and Buddhist. But these weren't the only players on the field. The general nobility were on the rise. We know one noble house, the Fujiwaras. But they weren't the only ones, not by far. Collectively, these houses were called kuge. The kuge hailed from old clans and were the top layer of society, and as such had access to a lot of money, which they used to invest in land. Usually a kuge had to support his lifestyle in Heian. He didn't want to spend his time working a farm, so he hired people to oversee the work. A kuge's estate was known as a shoin. These estates were rather large, so they were further divided among smaller landlords under the direct command of the kuge. Of course, these lands also needed to be defended, so the kuge started hiring and raising their own private armies. The kuge did not have to pay income tax from the produce sold from the shoin, since the land was under the protection of the land reform. Using this, they turned the shoin into an investment fund, where the private army retainers and the landlords would own shares of the shoin, and thusly received their tax-free salary. The people who received this salary was known as shiki, loyal to the kuge of their shoin. This all of course meant that the imperial administration, that is the proper government, was losing out on all this tax. The shoins grew in size. They were spread throughout the country, away from each other, and they soon became like small independent states. Around the time when the Fujiwaras lost their hold on the throne, the shoins together, though not united in any way, owned just about as much land as the government. On these shoin, a new class of wealthy people arose, the buke, a class of aristocrats born from service in the military. The people working professionally in the area of local military operations, like fighting bandits and in the north Emishi, became known as the Bushi, which means warrior. They didn't just fight, however. They acted mainly as administrators and overseers, but more and more these Bushi clashed with each other in the name of their lords. A certain way of life started to form around them, where honor sprung from the service of their lord. To serve, in Japanese, saburao, serves as the root for what we call them today, the samurai, the men which the Bushi had serving under them. At the beginning of the Heian period, usually an entourage of 4 to 5 people, grew and grew, and soon a Bushi would have a lot of footmen. Several Bushi under the same lord would join together, and here we have armies taking form. This was something inconsequential for the Kuge residing in Heian, as they were more interested in poetry than war, but war would come. The Fujiwara had but lost power completely by the 1150s, and the power vacuum leads to war between the two clans Taira and Minamoto. Long story short, the Taira has infested the imperial court and is doing what the Fujiwara was doing, but the Minamoto wouldn't have it. In what is known as the Genpei War, the Minamoto ousts the Taira from power. The Minamoto does something new after their victory. They proclaim that staying in the court made the Taira weak. For the Minamoto to stay strong, their seat of power should be away from the emperor, so the Minamoto keeps their seat of power in Kamakura, at the fringes of the realm, by the great plains of Kanto. Power, it seems, has yet again slipped from the emperor's grasp, and real power lays with the chieftain of the Minamoto, shifted away from Heian into Kamakura. And with that, the Heian period ends, and the Kamakura period starts. That's it for today's episode. I hope you strong and handsome listeners will join me again next time.